Welcome to the second CLSP seminar of the semester. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Maureen Stone. Maureen is at the Department of Biomedical Sciences and Orthodontics, or maybe it's only orthodontics, I'm not sure, at the University of Maryland Dental School, and she's also the director of the Vocal Tract Visualization Laboratory. So of course, nowadays with the web, I don't need to introduce any speaker. Everybody goes to their webpage and reads about them, but there is something you won't find on her webpage. Maureen her affiliation with CLSP goes way back before me, even before Fred Jelinek. So when CLSP was founded, Maureen was originally a research professor in the department and she was one of the original members of CLSP, along with Moritz Goldstein. And in fact, when I first came to CLSP, my office was next to hers up in Barton in that little corner. So I've known her for 12 plus years now. Since then, of course, she moved on to Maryland, where she's now a professor. And she's done some really nice work on essentially the vocal tract, visualizing it, and she'll show you some cool things today and tell you about it. And her affiliation with Hopkins is now reviving. I think since 2 or 3 years she's been working with Jerry Prince in his lab and with Andreas Andreu. So I'll let her tell you more about her lab and her work. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Are these mics in the right place? Okay. As for my departmental affiliation, as with so many things, our department name changed. So it was the Department of Biomedical Sciences, and then we split into 3 departments: microbiology and immunology, not for me; cellular and molecular, not for me; neural and pain sciences, that's where I am. But I'm one of the very few people who actually is not inflicting pain on my subjects purposely. But in a dental school, as you can imagine, there's a lot of interest in pain. Okay, so let's get on with this talk. I'm going to talk about a few different things today. First, I will just talk a little bit about tongue anatomy, since I assume that you are not that knowledgeable about it, just a little bit. Then I will talk about some of the instruments that we use in the lab. Our bread and butter instrument is ultrasound. We've used that for years and years. In fact, I used it since I first started working in this field at the NIH when I worked intramurally down at the NIH. And you can simply take standard ultrasound, hold it under the tongue, and get very nice images of tongue motion. I'll also talk about MRI. We've been using MRI since the early 1990s, actually since I first came to Hopkins. I started working with Elliot McVeigh, with Andrew Douglas, with I don't know, some other people are here, and a bunch of PhD students, and we started applying it to the tongue. The first time we ever did a tongue measurement, I was the subject, and I had to repeat the task 256 times. My gating device was the MRI noise. You know, it goes bleep, 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 bleep. And I had to say the word to the first bleep, and maybe the second syllable was the second bleep. I'm not exactly sure what the timing was. After I had repeated the task 100 times, I no longer could tell which bleep was which bleep. And by the time I was finished with 256 repetitions, they wheeled me out of the MRI, everybody laughing quite dramatically, and pointed me to the console. And there was this beautiful image of my head and no tongue, because the synchrony had been so bad that it had completely washed out. So we decided we may need to wait a few years to continue the research. And about a year or 2 later, we were down to about 23 repetitions and then 13 repetitions, and then the research took off.
Was this when you had to have your head in some sort of vice?
The head is still in a coil. Head coil. We use a vise actually for the ultrasound to keep the head still. Not quite a vise, but we certainly don't say that in the front of the subject. And then finally, I'll also just talk a little bit about a tongue model. I'm working with a bunch of different people who are developing tongue models, and I'll just present one. So first, the anatomy of the tongue. The tongue is a very unusual structure. It has no bones and no joints. In the heart, the heart is really the only other structure in the body that's composed of muscle that is of the same composition. As a result, motion is accompanied by deformation. The term that is used for structures like this is muscular hydrostat, and this term was coined by Smith and Keir a number of years ago in a classic paper of theirs called Tongues, Trunks, and Tentacles, where they talked about structures that were made entirely of muscle. A true hydrostat, that term already existed, and it referred to a squid or an octopus or a structure that did not have any hard bones, but instead had a fluid-filled sac that was used for structure. Oops. A muscular hydrostat, however, has no bones, no joints, and no fluid-filled sac. It's composed entirely of soft tissue, as in the elephant's trunk, tentacle, or tongue. There are two very important key features of muscular hydrostats. The first is that they have orthogonal muscles in 3 directions. And the second is that they are volume preserving. Their size is constant, and compression in one location means that you must have expansion in another location. Once you keep that in mind, everything else about the tongue is perfectly reasonable and has to happen the way it does. This is the human tongue. Each of these colors represents a different muscle and represents the orthogonality of the muscles. So A and B show slices at the front of the tongue. And the human tongue has 100 alternating lamina of horizontal and vertical fibers. The red fibers are vertical, and the green fibers are horizontal in orientation. So towards the midline, we have genioglossus muscle, and towards the lateral margin, we have verticalis muscle. Okay, I have a pointer. So for A and B, up here, at the front of the tongue, there is no genioglossus. So we have verticalis and then transverse muscle. As we move farther down, or farther back, more of the tongue kicks in and we get genioglossus muscle at midline, verticalis, and alternating with transverse. Again, as we go farther back, we see the same story. And finally, most posteriorly, the same story. So the tongue is really arced in shape. It forms an arc, as does the vocal tract. And that's, what, of course, what distinguishes the human vocal tract from animal vocal tracts is this dramatic curve. Okay, I have often said when I show this movie that you will forget my talk, but you won't forget this movie. This is the movie that I show for people who think that the tongue might be a rigid body or might be very ordinary or simple in its motions. The tongue is very complicated, and this is what happens when a muscular hydrostat deforms. Can you hear that? Oh, I know. I have to take it away from here. Hold on. No. I think this may do it. Yes, okay, now you have it and I don't, but that's probably still better. I'm afraid I'm at maximum volume. I don't know if I have another knob here, but okay.
Probably is a volume button on the screen which might help. Here we go.
Ah, very good. Oh yes, there it is. Beautiful, thank you. All right, well, now it may be very loud. Actually, I'm sorry, let me just orient you for a second. The front of the tongue is on the right. The back of the tongue is on the left. The tongue surface is this bright white line, and the tongue is in here. It's a huge structure. The tongue is actually everything from here on down. So it's much bigger than you normally think of when you just look at your tongue being protruded. Okay, and obviously this is a harmonica player. This is the floor of the mouth. He's watching himself, and so after he plays the first few bars, he starts to laugh, and then he says things every once in a while, and then he continues playing.
So, Maureen, I'm forgetting my anatomy here, but where's the point at which in the image, at which the tongue becomes free of the bottom of the mouth?
Okay, so this is the floor of the mouth. Remember that ultrasound does not pass through the air barrier. So we actually are not seeing the very tip of the tongue here because there's air between the floor and the tip. So this is the whole tongue. Coming up into here, you may sometimes see a shadow, which is the hyoid bone in the back. So whether or not the tip is free of the tongue depends what you're doing with it. It actually can pull back so it's almost a part of the body. But I would say that around here is where it becomes free. And you'll see the tongue deforming, and you'll see the tip looking just like a line, because unless the mouth is filled with water, you don't see the underside.
I'm having trouble understanding how we're seeing the whole.
Okay.
I think of the tongue as being longer than it is thick.
No,
but here what we're seeing is a pie.
That's right. The tongue is not longer than it is thick. Think of the tongue as a quarter of a circle with a tip stuck on the end of it. It's really a very huge structure. If you've ever eaten a cow's tongue, It's a huge, huge structure, and just a little bit of it is a tip. It's just that we don't see that huge structure. But the tongue starts here at the vocal folds, just above the vocal folds, above the thyroid, and then comes all the way up. And all of this tissue under here is actually tongue. So the jaw muscles are in here, and then all this is the tongue. So here's the tip. See, it touches the palate, it flattens. I thought they just blow when they play the harmonica, but apparently there's a little more to it. And if you've ever seen people playing any musical instrument, we just had someone come in and record a clarinet, and of course if you've ever played the flute, you know there's a lot that goes on in the mouth to direct and funnel that airstream. And of course speech is same story. Okay, so now I'm going to try and do this without looking here, but looking there. Oh, actually I can see it here, never mind. Okay, you probably know all about ultrasound. Basically, it reflects, it refracts, and when you have soft tissue, some of it is sent back to the transducer, and that's how we get our image. The sound wave is converted into a video image. Okay, sorry, this you probably don't need this. And basically, it's a focused beam, like a flashlight, rather than like a light bulb or like sound coming out of the mouth. Again, I apologize. You probably all know that perfectly well. Ultrasound reflections within the human body are interesting to note. The soft tissue air interface is almost 100%, and that's why we get a fairly good image of the tongue. Within the tongue itself, we have a fair amount of fat, we have all kinds of refraction going on, and that's why we don't get as good an image in ordinary ultrasound. More expensive machines nowadays actually give you very good images within the tongue.
So this is, let's say, a ultrasound wave going in the soft tissue, and it encounters an air barrier. You're saying it reflects back.
Right. I'm trying. Here's a better picture. So basically, this is exactly what we do in the lab. We put the subject's head in a head holder, which has a clamp in the front, a clamp in the back, and one at each temporal lobe. And the transducer is held rigidly under the chin, usually with a standoff, so the jaw can move up and down freely. Then the sound wave is from multiple crystals. These B-mode transducers have a couple hundred crystals, and they emit in a radial direction. And the sound comes back and is reconstructed into an image based on the strength of the echo and the time it took to return. That is how the image is reconstructed. So the image, the way you see her, the angle of this transducer is exactly what you see here. So the front of the tongue is on the right, the back of the tongue is on the left. When the person is in this device, we basically have the transducer and the image in head space. So we can have them swallow water. When the water is in the mouth, the sound goes all the way through to the palate bone and back, and we get an image of the palate. And we can extract that image and superimpose it on this image and make measurements. We also can measure velar position and get the velar-palatal junction as a tissue point and measure that across subjects as a kind of a normalization point as well.
Maureen, question. So is the beam like a fan, or
yes.
Is it sagittal plane, or is this?
No, it's a planar fan. It's a focused beam, and at the point you choose to resolve, it's a little less than 2 millimeters thick.
It's a pretty thin beam.
It's a very thin beam, but because there are 100 or more crystals in there, each one is sending out a beam. Right, and then they're all being reconstructed. So this is also a movie, I believe. Oh, I don't hear it. It should be growing. Okay, I'll say it for you. She's saying it slowly. Growing. You can see her lips. Growing. Okay, and again, we see the deformation. And actually here we have imposed, this is the next step in our data analysis. We extract the edge, the contour. From this, we extract the edge. This is a beautiful example of an R showing this tremendous deformation. She's saying growing, but what I've actually given you is golly. And this is a bunch of extracted contours. First, the G has a high back, the tip of the tongue comes up for the L, and the body comes up again for the E. This is traditional, where color represents time. We have a modified version, and this was actually developed by Vijay Parthasarathi, who was a PhD student here a couple of years ago in Jerry Prince's lab. And he has drawn it so that color represents tongue height, which becomes very functionally useful for us, which I'll show you in a minute. Okay, before I do that, I'll just show you a swallow, another very attractive thing to watch. So here you see the palate. You see the soft palate going up and down with each swallow. The water comes in. You can even see the air bubbles in the water. The hyoid bone swings up to protect the airway for each swallow. This is the shadow cast by the jaw. Okay, and here is that very nice, we call this a surface, Vijay's work. And here is a 3D surface, which is basically the mid-sagittal tongue moving in time. And at the beginning, we have the bolus being held steady in the front of the mouth. Then the bolus is propelled backwards. And then moment by moment, the tongue elevates from front to back. So it's a very nice way to display this very high dimensional event. Okay, now three-dimensional tongue. This is a way to look at co-articulation in 3D, because typically when we study almost anything, we study it 2D. We use EMMA, we use X-rays, and we have 2D information. And the question is, how important is 3D information? So we thought we would take a look at a co-articulatory effect using ultrasound. I think for those of you who don't know what co-articulation is, the short version is simply that every sound in speech is affected by its neighbor. And so it's not spoken in isolation, and it is affected by its neighbor. And so the question is, how far does that effect extend? C versus SU, the lips round for the S, because the S is not specified, so it takes on the lip rounding for the U or the spreading for the E. Oops, did that go away? Oh, this. It's back, but the signal is lost, it tells me. I'll look here. Okay, oh, there it is. Information of sound occurs longer for a longer period of time, and that helps the listener. And the articulations are in constant motion, which allows speech to be faster. So these are just little pieces of information about co-articulation. Okay, so we did 3D tongue reconstructions from 2D ultrasound slices, and these are the slices. We had a mid-sagittal slice, then we took a bunch of 2D slices by changing the orientation of the transducer, and then we figured out where they were and reconstructed them into a 3D surface. So first, let me show you a couple of the 2D surfaces. This is a mid-sagittal slice for the sentence "it ran a lot," and we chose "it ran a lot" because we then contrasted it with "it rang a lot."
It ran a lot. It ran a lot. It ran a lot. It ran a lot.
Okay, and now the first coronal slice, if you look at these pictures, you'll be able to get a sense of the angle of the beam from the photograph. So this is now a cross section.
It ran a lot. It ran a lot. It ran a lot. It ran a lot.
That's intra-subject variation. And then a little bit farther back, another slice.
It ran a lot. It ran a lot.
You can see how very different the
ran a
shape of the
lot.
tongue is at different
It ran
times.
a lot.
And finally in the tongue
It ran
root.
a lot. It ran a lot. It ran a lot. It ran a lot.
Okay, so if you can't mentally put that together, we've done that for you. This is ran and rang.
It rang a lot.
Oh, sorry, I thought they were going to go
It
together.
ran a lot.
Never mind, I'll put them together. Here they are together. This is just the word ran and rang. And at the bottom, we actually have the original slices for the two of them, and you'll see them diverge for the word ran and rang. Okay, I'll do that once more. Okay, so we can see clearly they're different. This is just the word itself, and now how far does it extend throughout the sentence? If we look at the bottom where it says total, we see a divergence roughly where the N and the NG occur in the word. But if we start to go from front to back, we can see that the divergence occurs at different times at different locations of the tongue. In other words, co-articulation doesn't take place in a nice, neat manner because the tongue isn't really acting as a single articulator. So we see something happening early on in the front of the tongue By the time we get to the N and the NG, it's been well established. This is more during the transition. Whereas farther back, things are happening later.
Excuse me, how did you align the two sequences together?
They're all aligned using the speech wave, and they were all aligned to the mid-sagittal slice, and which actually was the slowest, so it ended up being a fair amount of interpolation. So we just interpolated frames, or tongue contours.
Are you asserting that the differences in the vowel quality are physically caused by adaptation to the following sound? Or you're not saying anything about what causes it?
So you mean the difference
You
between the
call it
a and ran and rang?
Right.
Yes.
That's different than bat and bad.
Well, that's a good question. It may not be entirely different because we know that the angma will create a tensing of a vowel. It will raise the tongue a bit for the vowel. Yes, for bat and bad, that there's a length effect, and when we lengthen, we tend to diphthongize. It's not exactly the same reason, but it could be a similar effect. Sorry, you're saying something else?
Well, in my dialect, the length doesn't matter. Back there, rack rag. But what I'm trying to get at is what are you attributing the change in vowel quality between ran and rang?
The change in vowel quality right here, I'm attributing to the consonant. Your change in vowel quality may actually be a secondary articulatory device to enhance the distinction since you're not using vowel
I
lengthening.
guess what I'm saying is, are you asserting that the difference in vowel quality couldn't be otherwise?
Oh, not at all. I think you could do it exactly for the other purpose, to enhance the distinction. But I also know that angma in particular does tend to tense lax vowels.
Okay.
So like rin versus ring or rig versus ring
Okay.
will have the E in ring is tenser than the I in rig.
I'm just going to get at the nature of co-articulation.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so the tongue has many degrees of freedom. It's flexible in 3 dimensions, and we could have thousands of possible 3D surface shapes. We considered that, and were really horrified at the thought. But then realized that over many, many years of looking at ultrasound, we really hadn't seen thousands of different degrees of freedom. We've seen really very limited number of shapes. We've even looked at a few people speaking different languages, like Arabic, where we have some very unusual sounds. And still, we hadn't seen shapes we'd never seen before. We just saw them at times we didn't expect to see them. So we thought maybe we could do a little bit better at distinguishing what the shapes are that were possible, at least in American English. And so we studied 18 lingual sounds, obviously not PB and M since we're using ultrasound of the tongue. And also in English, many sounds are homoorganic. So for S and Z, we just looked at S. For TD and N, we just looked at N. Anything we could eliminate that way, we did. And we boiled it down to 18 sounds, and we got 3D surface shapes for those sounds. Before you get too excited, I should tell you this is only one subject. Okay. So, however, it's consistent with what we've seen in 2D. The first shape we found was front raising. This should be a very familiar sound to anybody, or familiar shape to anybody who's studied linguistics and shapes of tongues. Peter Ladefoged, Harshman, Ladefoged, and Goldstein coined this shape in 1978 maybe. Front raising and back raising were the terms that they used to describe vowels. They did a principal component analysis and found that these 2 components described all the vowels of English, or accounted for most of the variants, with one weighting of one or the other. So this is the 2D version of front raising is that the front of the tongue is high and the back of the tongue is low and maybe a little bit concave. And what we see here is the 3D version, which is that the front of the tongue is level or even arched, and the back of the tongue has a very deep groove. And this is all very, very anatomically reasonable because genioglossus is a very, very midline muscle that pulls the tongue in locally. The second shape, front raising, that was front raising. The second shape is back raising. That's oo, all these back raising sounds. And basically you have something that's kind of quadratic looking. I've lost my mouse. Okay, in which the tongue elevates in the back and is pulled in the front and is pulled in the way back. These pictures, by the way, are all drawn to scale. Each square, one side is a half a centimeter, but they're drawn with perspective. The third shape was a continuous groove or continuous channel, and The sound A exemplifies that, and we see a channel throughout. This is what most people think of when they think of the tongue, that the tongue should look like this. When you look at it in 2D, it's considered to be a weak case of front raising, but in fact, it's actually got more of a groove. And the final one is a shape that's only seen for R and L in English, 2-point displacement, where both the front is displaced and the root is displaced. And in between, we have a groove or a giant depression. So this categorized all of the sounds of English, and in the data that we've seen before and after, this is still very consistent for English. And as I said, for other languages, we still see sort of a concatenation of arches, regions of arch and regions of groove. It's just a matter of where the arches and grooves are. So it shows the tongue, fortunately, has a few limits. Okay, let me move on to a couple of applications and projects for ultrasound and then move to MRI. I'm working with the group in France, in Paris, who is developing a silent speech interface, which is extracting speech without a speech wave, but looking at articulatory movements. And basically, it started with some ultrasound data. You notice that in our ultrasound data, we also have lip data. Come back. Okay, and here we go. So, basically, we start with the ultrasound and the lip data. The data set that was used for this was the Harvard corpus. They came here and recorded a couple of subjects saying 1,500 sentences, then did a video to phonetic decoding. I'm trying to get this in the right order. Okay, so there's an AV speech corpus. They did synthesis and speech. This is a summary of the whole project. Let me go into the details a little bit. First, a principal component analysis was done on the ultrasound and the lip images. Okay, and then anytime a new image, the test data set came in, they were interpreted as a weighted combination of the principal components based on the training set. Can you see that? Okay. Sorry, I'm not seeing the whole image here. Okay, so essentially a code book of sorts was developed for diphones, and when a new word would come in, it would be divided into diphones visually. The diphones in the dictionary or the code book were found. The best match, of course there were many choices, the best match was found, and the speech waves were put together to produce speech. Okay. Using this method, they had fairly good representation. There's absolutely no other model. There's no language model in this at all. This is just the very first steps. And they did quite well. The kinds of errors they had were exactly what you would expect. They could not distinguish sounds that were within the same group, T, D, and N, for example. They had trouble with voicing. They had trouble with nasality. But interestingly, they got a little bonus because the hyoid bone motion was in the movement. So they did actually fairly well on prosody, on pitch, because the hyoid bone reflects that. The hyoid and the larynx go up and down with pitch. Okay. And actually, before I leave that, I should mention that one of the collaborators of this will be at our lab on Friday giving a talk. I know Andrea is going to come and hear it, so if anyone else is interested, by all means talk to him. It'll be there at 2 o'clock on Friday. Okay, I presented this talk, it's this paper. This is a very small project, but I know that this summer some of you guys were working on aging, and so I'm just going to present this. We were studying 20 women, 10 between the ages of 20 and 30, and 10 between the ages of 64 and 82. They were all extremely healthy and had normal hearing, and spoke with an Eastern dialect, Eastern US dialect. We had them say many things, but what we measured was a seep, a sop, a soup, a sheep, a shop, a shoop, a reap, a rop, a roop, each one repeated 5 times. And then we mid-sagittal ultrasound data and speech wave. This is an example of an overlay of all of the tongue contours for one speaker, which is quite a bit. But that is not how we chose the spokes. We chose the spokes by looking at each subset and picking optimal locations for the constriction for each sound. So spoke 1 represented S, spoke 2 represented E and sh, spoke 3 represented the constriction for R, spoke 4 represented the constriction for U, but in this case we didn't choose that. We actually chose the junction between the hard palate and the soft palate, which we did exactly as you see here by measuring the soft palate in multiple positions and then finding that data point. and then the ah was chosen in the pharyngeal region. And we wanted the constriction, of course, because we know that the constriction is the least sensitive to everything. It's the most stable part of the vocal tract during a sound. And so in aging, that would be the most important thing to preserve. And we wanted to know what happened there, and we also measured a spoke that was not in the constriction to see what happened outside the constriction.
Maureen, when you say the tongue displacement and velocity, it is from what reference?
Yes, that's a very good question, thank you. It is, we're assuming that the tongue is moving in a radial direction. One could actually look at it in a number of different ways, but we're assuming a radial motion. So that's why we did a polar grid. And the radius, or the origin of the grid is the halfway point between the minimum and the maximum x, and a few millimeters below the contour. We didn't want to get so low that we didn't have a radial component, but we didn't want to be too high either. So.
But the displacement wouldn't, for example, account for any, let's say...
Yes, you are absolutely right.
Movement of the muscle.
Yes. Well, it would not account for the front-back motion of the tongue. Well, it would a little bit. But the alternative was to look at x and y as two variables. And typically when you do that, you find that the motions account are fairly radial, that there's more noise in the direction of the vocal tract. So if you look at a repeated measure of something, you tend to have more noise or more variability in the direction. The direction of the constriction is more stable than orthogonal to that. So the tongue might move a little bit farther forward, a little farther back in multiple repetitions, but the distance from the palate is more stable, is less variable. So that's why we decided that the radial, giving us that distance, would be the better measure.
Why do you have these outliers, the extra lines?
The ones on the top? Okay, I didn't make that clear. This is the hard palate. You remember I told you we extracted that from the swallow? And then we also, when you saw that continuous swallow a few minutes ago, you saw the soft palate going up and down with the swallow. What happens is as the bolus, as the water moves back, it pushes the soft palate up, which then stays tight so that the liquid doesn't get into your nose. Then it comes down again as the water passes. So by measuring that motion, the hard palate, of course, has bone, but the soft palate does not. So by getting that juncture, we had a real tissue point, which was the junction between the hard and the soft palate. So for every subject, even though there's variability, and ultrasound is really not good for finding landmarks, unlike MRI, but that is a true tissue point that at least for each subject, we could put spoke number 4 there and know that that was constant across subjects. Okay. So we did 2 kinds of analyses, one's of the acoustic durations and one of the tongue motions. For the acoustic durations, we found that there was significance in a lot of, significance as a function of age in a lot of the measurements, but they weren't hugely different. So for example, utterance duration was a little bit longer for the older group. Variability was greater for the older group, as we would expect. The duration of just the CV, so if it was a seep, just the C, was a little bit longer for the older group. The ratio of the schwa duration divided by the total duration was not significant, and the ratio of any specific phoneme, the consonant or the vowel, divided by the total also was not quite significant. It was really very, very small. Nonetheless, if there were any differences, we did see some differences as a function of duration, where you have to basically be coordinating all of the structures.
So what's their model for duration? What are they trying to achieve?
They're just trying to say a seep. They're just, I'm literally looking at their own personal idiosyncratic duration. I mean, one of the things that we thought was possible, we know that there are neurological components to aging, and one of the things that we expected we might see was slowing of the behaviors. And so we started by looking.
Like if I said to a younger person or an older person, walk from here to here.
Yes, exactly.
And
let them pick their own pace.
this is not a word, so.
No, it's not. And they repeated it 5 times. So it's, you know, a seep, a seep, a seep. So they might get a little slower, a little faster.
Model in the language.
Yes. So,
Right.
I mean, there's a standard relationship between how long each sound will take within the whole thing and roughly how long you would speak. But we did find little differences, but it depends what you want to make of it. You're right, this was not a long enough task to say, yes, they're really slower. I thought these differences were actually quite small. And in fact, well, let me get to the end of this and then I'll come back to that. Because let me talk about the tongue. When we looked for the tongue, we actually looked at 3 variables. We looked at age, phoneme, and context for each of the measurements. And when we looked at the velocity of a particular phoneme, well, actually, okay, when we looked at anything, age was not significant. Oops. Okay. Phoneme was significant for a lot of them, but that's sensible because, of course, some phonemes are inherently longer or shorter than others. And then context was not significant. So I don't know if this is going back to what you're asking, Jack, but essentially the things that might have been a function of age were not. Let me see how these go. Okay. Let me go through the interpretation and then ask me again, see if this does anything for you. The tongue patterns did not differ by age. The age difference in the literature typically looks at vocal fold behaviors, hoarse voice, tension in the voice, crackly voice, and maybe these are due to tissue changes or oral dryness rather than control issues. Another feature is that the acoustic durations were different, even though they were very small. So this potentially reflects a change in the coordination between the articulators. There are arguments that are made that age-related issues are due to disease rather than to normal aging. I'm not going to go out on a limb and say that I agree with that, but this would not contradict that. On the other hand, it is possible that if you had to preserve one thing in speech and you had some neurological issues, the thing you would try and preserve probably would be the clarity of the individual sound, which would be what's happening at the constriction. Now, it happens that we didn't see significant differences even within the tongue, not at the constriction, but it may be that the entire tongue is something that you would try and preserve more than, say, your voice quality. So it's really not possible for us to say that the vocal folds are somehow affected and the tongue is spared. That's a possibility, but it's also possible that people are kind of focusing their effort in the place where it's linguistically most important. So I don't know if that addresses what you were concerned
I
with.
was just, if you gave people a sentence to say, like, that's pig and poke, and then you have some controls to look at duration, then you'd be talking about linguistically motivated durations and how they fare.
Yes, you're right. These
so
are not
forth.
linguistically
But
motivated.
A peep and a poke, so for those are not linguistic targets strictly, they're just
Right. Right.
sound sequences.
That's
so
right.
I'm not sure what like I said.
Well, words of English.
No, they're not.
Well, some of them are a sheep and a
Don't
sheep.
violate English phonetics.
That's right. That's correct.
So,
So you can get people to do it.
Right.
But as I say, it seems like saying walk from here to there,
Right.
which is, you could observe how younger and older people did it.
Right. In a
It's not
sense,
linguistic.
right, you're right. If getting into something linguistically meaningful, then we would need to have a very large corpus to rule out other things. I mean, what if one person is more interested in something or more familiar with this word than another person? All of those things might affect it as well. So this was pure in that sense. But you are right that the motivation, that there is no linguistic need to do anything with these. On the other hand, they did do them well, so at least the task wasn't
I
hard.
argue that there is a need. They probably knew before they started recording that these were the 3 words or these were the 6 combinations that they said.
Right.
So if nothing else, they're trying to preserve distinction. They're trying to make
Well, that's why I
their
asked the
suit
original
different
question
from
was whether
sheep.
you gave them a model. If they were imitating the experimenter, that
Oh.
would be one thing.
I can tell you what they had to do. So basically, they knew they were saying a consonant, and then we'd say, okay, now everything's going to be the vowel E, and it's going to be something E, and they've got to practice too. So first is going to be S, and they would say a seep, a seep. We say, great, okay, now sh, and they go a sheep, a sheep, a sheep. Now a reap, a reap.
So it's an articulatory exercise that calls on their linguistic ability, but it's not a linguistic exercise.
It's not a linguistically meaningful exercise, for sure. Okay. Okay, so tongue surface changes in shape, but we're interested also in the underlying muscle activity. Ideally, we would use EMG to look at this, but the tongue muscles, because they are interdigitated, make EMG difficult, if not impossible, on most of the muscles in the tongue. So therefore, we've been using magnetic resonance imaging to try and extract some information about muscles.
What do you mean by interdigitated?
The muscles, remember I said that the tongue is a muscular hydrostat, and all of the muscles are orthogonal. Well, in order to not have blocks of muscles, we actually have very fine groupings. I mentioned that there were 100 lamina alternating horizontal and vertical. So not only do we have these horizontal and vertical muscles like this, but immediately above and immediately below, we have muscles that are orthogonal in the other direction. And these muscles that are going vertical go right through the longitudinal muscles. So the longitudinal muscles are completely invaded by the vertical muscles. The transverse muscles, actually, they do form lamina, so they don't go quite in between each other, but you have these alternating lamina are very much like being interdigitated. I mean, it's not fiber by fiber, but certainly bundle by bundle. So to put an EMG hooked wire electrode in there is not very helpful. I mean, you can get some surface information with crosstalk on some of the longitudinal muscles, but unless you look at the extrinsic muscles right where they originate by the bones, it's virtually impossible to distinguish them. We actually have that same problem with the diffusion tensor imaging. If we seed the muscle, we have to seed it where it's bundled, because if you seed it where it's interdigitated, the vectors wash each other out, and you don't have any maximal direction of diffusion of water. Okay, so magnetic resonance imaging measures the hydrogen in human tissue. It's found in water and fat, and so soft tissue is imaged very well. Structures with a lot of water appear white, including muscle, fat, and bone marrow. In fact, I always tell people, if you need to know whether you're looking at an MRI or an X-ray CT, look at the teeth. If the teeth are white, it's a CT. If they're black, it's an MRI. The MRI doesn't image bone. Okay, so we use 4 types of MRI in our research. The first 2 are static, high resolution and diffusion tensor imaging. Again, I don't know if you know these processes. High resolution is really your basic MRI, but done for a really long time with different types of weighting to enhance the kind of tissue that you're interested in. This is, of course, the tongue, the soft palate, the lips, the marrow inside the jaw you can see is very white, whereas the bone and the teeth are black. This is fascia, etc. Diffusion tensor imaging is the tracking of fibers. The colors represent direction of fibers. So this is genioglossus muscle, which we see here as a radial muscle. We see here the vertical and the horizontal fibers being shown. An interesting thing in these images is that the soft palate appears to be resting on the tongue. These subjects are lying supine on their back, and the tongue is resting on the soft palate because it's falling back a little bit as they breathe quietly. If you look at an X-ray, you'll never see the soft palate and the tongue touching each other because gravity is pulling the tongue down. When we actually look at speech on MRI, we don't see this either, but this is just something to show you that gravity is really operational at all times. Okay, so the way DTI works is it measures the diffusion of water in tissue. Diffusion gradients are applied in multiple directions. We use 6 directions, and it describes the 3D shape of the water diffusion. Water is diffused preferentially along the main direction of the fiber. So a fiber, or a nerve, which is a nerve or a muscle in our case, can be tracked along its length. The other 2 types of MRI that we use are cine-MRI, and if this may be a movie, yes. This is E-oo, E-oo, and then a breath. E-oo, and the velum lowers for the breath. This is a tagged image of the same thing. Oops. Come on, baby. Maybe it isn't. Well, let's see. This is the overlay of the tags and the cine. Let's see if this one's going to be a movie. E-oo. Very good. And what you can see is that the boxes deform. So at the time that the MRI tags are being applied, they form a grid, and then as the subject moves, the tissue deforms, the magnetism moves with the tissue, and so the grid deforms and shows us where the compressions and expansions are, shows us velocity data, displacement data, strains, etc. Okay, so just very briefly, and I actually maybe should even skip this because I spent so much time on ultrasound. Do you want me to go into MRI and tags or just go to applications? Any kind of a vote? Oops. All right, well, all right, very briefly, an RF pulse knocks the hydrogen protons out of alignment while they're with the main magnetic field. While they're out of alignment, a spatial gradient is applied, which takes some of the protons in planes and demodulates them so that they are no longer in phase with the others. another RF pulse realigns the hydrogen protons, and the protons that are out of phase are invisible to the image. This gives you black lines in the middle of the image because this is planes that are not being read by the MRI. Again, as the tissue deforms, the tags deform with it. We have a much more complex mechanism for creating the tags, but I'm not going to go into it here. We'll do that another time. I see Jerry Prince is here, and he can actually tell you a lot more about it because he is the one who developed this whole thing, originally for the heart, and now has been adapting it for us for the tongue, he and his students as well. So this has been devised for the heart, and that leaves some challenges for us because the heart differs from the tongue in significant ways. The heart has simple kinematics with no regional variation, highly repeatable heartbeats that are independent of the rate of contraction, and the heartbeat cycles are easily synchronized temporally in the MRI machine using the ECG signal. The tongue, on the other hand, has highly complex and variable deformations due to the highly complex muscular architecture, and low precision due to imperfect subject repeatability and temporal synchronization. I was once working with a math student, and he was trying to do an analysis, and the variability over 5 repetitions was an average of 1 millimeter for the entire contour. And he said to me, "Can't you get them to repeat it until they say it right?" I said, "This is really as good as it gets." Okay, so we track tags, and I've just clicked on a bunch of points here so you can see them in motion. Color represents time, and each color represents 2 time phases. There are 12 time phases. The first time phase is a light blue, and there's no motion. This is the motion from E to U, followed by a breath, which you can see the soft palate lowering. E-U, the tip of the lips protrude, and the tongue moves back. Let's see if this becomes a movie. Good. E-U, E-U, breath, E-U, breath, E-U, breath. So we can see the deformation quite nicely, and we can see the differences at different parts of the tongue and at the different structures in the vocal tract. From these, we want to get information about what's happening, patterns of motion in the tongue. And the first thing we look at is velocity patterns. So we see the lips moving out, and we see the tongue moving down and back. But we don't know if we're looking at translation, stretch, or both. So we look at principal strains of the same data set. And we can see that for the lips, the principal strains show expansion, and we see outward motion. But when we look at the tongue, we see that the region that is being moved backwards is actually not compressing or expanding. It's being pushed backward by compression that's occurring earlier in the tongue. And we find that within the within the tongue, we do find little regions that become rigid for periods of time, probably to facilitate control and more rapid motion of the tongue. Okay, so these are the kinds of things that we get from the data. So we see these occasional rigidities, we identify compressions consistent with known muscles, and we find that, however, velocity fields and principal strains are not really perfect indicators of muscle contraction because we can have passive compression, not necessarily active contraction. However, they're very good for testing specific theories and areas of interest. So I'm going to just tell you 2 areas quickly. One is glossectomy. Glossectomy is removal of part of the tongue due to surgery because you have tongue cancer. And the way you get tongue cancer is by smoking a pipe, a cigar, or using chewing tobacco and washing it down with alcohol. That's the best way. Okay, sleep apnea is the other application I'll mention, a tongue model that we're developing. And sleep apnea is what happens when you go to sleep, lie down, and your tongue falls back and cuts off your airway. And this happens particularly in very heavy people or in people who have flaccidity. It don't always have to be heavy. But the idea is that the airway is small to begin with. You saw that when you lie back, the tongue goes back, and it doesn't take much then, if you don't have some active genioglossus contraction to prevent the Bernoulli effect from closing off the airway. Okay, so and for this project, my collaborators are Amy Morano, Hideo Shinagawa, our 2 surgeons, and Jerry Prince and Xiaofeng Liu here. Okay, the glossectomy tongue is still a muscular hydrostat. It still has orthogonal muscles, and it still is volume preserving. However, it has lost the left-right symmetry. The tongue has mirror image muscles, and some of the muscles on one side have been removed. There are 2 subjects I'll present. One, and a normal. The normal was a 35-year-old male non-native English speaker, a native speaker of Japanese, who actually, yes, indeed, was one of our postdocs. One of our glossectomy speakers was a 43-year-old male native speaker of English. He was seen after a partial glossectomy that I won't go into it, but a T1N0M0 means it's a small tumor, no metastasis. His lymph nodes were normal, so they took what was called a dog bite out of the side of his tongue and put in a flap from the forearm. They take a flap of tissue from the arm, cut it to fit, and stick it on the tongue, vascularize it from the floor of the mouth, and give the tongue extra bulk so that you won't have such a big hole that you choke or can't produce speech. His speech was a little noisy. His S was like a lateral lisp. Yes, if you ever saw Columbo, he has a lateral lisp. This is what the flap looked like. They make the flap too big for two reasons. The first is that the flap shrinks, and no one can tell exactly how much it will shrink. And the second is if it's too small is worse than if it's too big. So, this is an MRI of his images. Here we see the sagittal image. This slices go right through it, and we can see the flap so beautifully. We weren't sure what it would look like, but it ends up that these flaps are very high in fat. So with T2 weighting, they show up very nicely. So here it is in the sagittal plane. In the coronal plane, we see the flap and the pedicle, which is the vascularization that they brought up to feed it with. And then in the axial plane, we see it. Okay, so, I think I only put one patient in this, so that's fine. This is the one we'll talk about. Basically, the top row is our normal subject, and the bottom row is our patient, and they're saying the word suk. So this is the motion from S to U and from U to K. And we see that the normal subject compresses, and expands, as you would expect in a muscular hydrostat. We have a volume-preserving system. And then that happens even more so as he goes from U to K. Our patient does the same thing from U to K. He pulls in and expands. But look at S to U. He rotates backwards and has this compression in the tip. The other patient, which is not in here, does that same thing. They rotate backwards. So instead of going ooh, ooh, like this, they elevate up like this. Ooh. So it's a more rigid motion. They're rotating around the scar tissue that they have, and they're adapting to this loss of tissue and to the scar that's in the tongue. And so these images allow us to understand what's going on a lot better than if we just have to look at the raw data and try and figure out what they're doing. And also, in this case, we can't actually see the scar on this patient because it's under the flap. So it helps us imagine where the scar would be. We need to actually look at more patients to see if this is truly something that everybody does, or if he simply behaves more like the closures where we know where the scar is, how unusual that is. Okay, the diffusion tensor imaging tracks the muscle fibers themselves. Inferior longitudinal is a muscle that goes from back to the front of the tongue. This is an axial cut of the tongue. The red lines are the jaw. This little white line is the jaw too. This circle is the airway in the back of the throat, and this is the inferior longitudinal muscle in our normal and our patient subject. On the left side here, this opposite of what you see, this is the left, and his flap is not visible, and the inferior longitudinal muscles do not continue. On the right side, we see the muscle, but we see it go from green to blue. And what that means is that instead of the muscle being a straight line, it's curving upward in the front. So we don't know if this is due to the scar, due to the reconstruction, but it's not the way we would expect it. And in the previous image, we just saw that huge depression as the tongue pulled down here during the S. So our question was, could this be happening because of the difference in the orientation of the muscle post-surgery? So, to test this, we extracted the fibers. Oops, there should be another picture. Okay, we extracted the fibers from the DTI. All our data are collected in perfectly aligned slices. So we extracted the fibers from the DTI, created an average fiber, and this is Xiaofeng Liu, who is Jerry's current student, did all of this work. He extracted it over, actually Hideo extracted it, and Xiaofeng overlaid it onto the MR images and then tracked the motion of the fiber over time. And except for two moments in time that mistracked. So the first thing we see is a very large difference in the shape and orientation of the fiber. And then when we look at differences in the patterns, we see that the patient first had more elongation initially moving into the S. We see that the the normal subject rotated backwards during the U and the K. Look better? No, it doesn't look better up there either. Okay. But the patient but had greater bend. Let's see what else. Oops. Sorry, this is not. Okay. The other point, which is not going to come up, is that both of them shortened the muscle, and the shortening is what we care about because shortening is where we're most likely to be seeing contraction. So the length of the muscle between the maximum S and the U and then the K is much shorter. 0 is the baseline length, and our normal subject actually shortens the muscle shorter than its resting length. Our patient never shortens beyond the resting length because it's so extended initially. So we cannot say for certain that actually this muscle is contracted, but it's consistent with contraction. So at any rate, the IL lengthens for both subjects during S, but especially for the patient. Since the lengthening is passive, it seems that the inferior longitudinal may not be active during S, although we do see it during the U. So it's possible that that elevated flap is actually what's more responsible for the noise that we're hearing during the S. Okay. All right, my second application quickly is sleep apnea. And again, this is being done by a private company that is making inserts to put in the tongue to prevent sleep apnea. They're already using this for snoring, and it's a kind of a rope-like device that's inserted into the tongue and hopefully will produce scarring to stiffen the tissue and prevent it from being so flaccid. Okay, so at any rate, we need to know the effects of an implant. We want to optimize the design without having to implant it in a lot of people unsuccessfully is the bottom line. So we've taken all these anatomical drawings, MRI images, and all kinds of anatomy, put them together into the model, into the muscle model, and then created a finite element model out of it. I think you know about stress tensors. Is that true? Okay. Let me back up. I won't get ahead of myself. So each of the elements contains more than one muscle fiber direction because, of course, of this interdigitation issue. And so we represent these directions with stress tensors that control all of the elements within a muscle. So, for example, this red is genioglossus anterior. And I don't think I actually gave you the control table. The way we control it is with a table. So we have equations of contraction, and the user, it's actually quite a simple process for the user. You just fill in the angle you want activated. It's activated with a sinusoid, where you want the sinusoid, what you want the amplitude and the spread to be, and then it will contract that muscle. And you set it up, and then you can go through a whole time sequence. So it's quasi-dynamic, going from one pattern to the next. So this is now our human subject and our model saying EU. And this is a different subject, not the one you saw before. This subject, in fact, moves more directly backwards. The other one moved a little bit more down and back. In the model, we have to do a little bit more than for the subject. The first thing we have to do is apply gravity, and that's the light pink line, which makes the tongue fall back. The next thing we have to do is move the tongue from E to U, and that's the dark pink line, and then the colored lines represent the from rest to E is the dark pink line, and then the colored lines are the motions from E to U. So, stop that. Oh, actually, this isn't a movie, sorry. But at any rate, we can see that we did pretty well in terms of the direction, but it's not exactly perfect. So basically, we have to tweak the contraction of the muscles, tweak the location of the muscles, and perfect it, and make it better, and then ultimately try and go to more subjects, which is the hardest part, which is re-registering the muscles from the next subject onto this model.
So, can you actually synthesize speech with this model, or is this just trying to?
The model is not stuck into a vocal tract, although we're working on a vocal tract because they're also developing an aerodynamic model. So yes, then you could synthesize speech with it, right? But you are still doing it in a very phonetic manner. So you're really doing it frame by frame. However, one could then write code to say, okay, this is how you go from E to U, or this is how you go from place A to place B. However, the goal of this, first of all, for sleep apnea, is to see what happens when the tongue falls back with and without an implant. But we also thought if we used it for something like the glossectomy patients, to literally model the patient and then see what muscles are needed to recreate what the patient is doing. And that should support what we're inferring from the MRI muscles. So if we say we think that this is it based on the MRI, we could put those muscles into the model and see if indeed that gives us the pattern or if we have to change it. One of our questions is, for normal now, do people tend to make things the same way and simply fine-tune things? So if you were going from E to U, does everybody tend to use hyoglosses and pull down and back with some fine-tuning? Or are there 4 or 5 different ways to make this, and we have to know each one of them? Or are there dozens of ways to make them, and they can almost be person-specific? And certainly then you have language-specific issues. Do you have certain patterns that are much more frequent in language A versus language B? That might expose a particular language, even though it might not sound particularly different, because if we have, especially if we have people doing different things, they may not, to the normal ear, they might sound quite fine, sort of a motor equivalence kind of thing, but they still could be different. Okay, so hopefully these two are movies. Oh, these are movies, but you can't see them, sorry. You can see them, but you don't see the effect very well. This is the motion without an implant, and this is the motion with the implant. It's stiffer, but I will show you a better version. This is 2 tongues, the tongue with the implant and the tongue without the implant, in the condition of just turning on gravity. So the tongue on the left is being seen from the back, and the tongue on the right is being seen from the side. And from the back, we can see that the left portion of the tongue, or the tongue without the implant, is farther back than the tan. And we can see that as well here, that the blue is farther back than the tan. In other words, with the implant, the tongue does not fall back as far when you just turn on gravity. So that's good. That's the goal. And this, of course, is the implant. Actually, the implant is here. It's very large, this aqua implant. But in fact, it's very thin and very porous. The idea is that the tissue of the tongue grows through it, holding it in, and then creates a rigidity from the scar around it. Okay. So this is the end. The finite element model basically incorporates physiologically accurate muscles and complex activation patterns. We can compare the model tongue motions with the tagged cine-MRI. In this case, we've done it for a normal speaker. And the model indicates that the implant slightly reduced large anterior-posterior speech motions by stiffening the tongue. That was the EU data. And then in the future, of course, we need to model more speech motions, more subjects, different implants, and then validate it with the tagged cine-MRI. Okay, so in the end, the complexity of the tongue can be explored with imaging instruments. Ultrasound and MRI provide different information about the tongue, and the best instrument, of course, depends on the goal. The ultrasound is much, much easier to use, but it gives you the surface, and it doesn't give you the whole vocal tract. Some applications include speech disorders, speech coding, validation of models. And that's it. Thank you. Okay, so I'm sorry, I have to make sure I got this question. So you said I was talking about tracking using ultrasound?
I mean, we can, like in cardiology, cardiologists usually use ultrasound to track the spigot, or we use spigot tracking to measure the motion of the myocardium itself.
Okay.
So how successful this technique will be in tracking the muscle?
I see, speckle tracking, thank you. Yes. The newer ultrasound machines, especially the very expensive ones, have much better resolution of the speckle patterns within the muscles, and you can see blood vessels. I have not actually tried. I actually don't have one of these newer, more expensive machines, so I have not really taken a good look at it. historically it has been a tremendous problem because the amount of muscle that is in one unit is so small because of this interdigitation and these very thin lamina. But theoretically, it would be possible to do that. The problem is that you really have to know your muscles. I think what we might do better with the ultrasound is, I shouldn't say that, we might do okay because even in that MRI, we were able to see the bottom edge of the superior longitudinal muscle. We were able to see the fascia and connective tissue where genioglossus merges with the others. So I think with better resolution, we may be able to do some of the muscle information extraction from the ultrasound. But it has not been done yet because it's really, the machines I've looked at, it's only very recently that you can see anything fairly useful in terms of that.
Real-time images and I think you don't need triggering. Not so.
You don't need what?
Triggering.
No, you don't. And in ultrasound, it's only one repetition. You don't need any kind of summation. No, ultrasound is the much easier instrument to use, for sure. And people are upright, and it's not invasive, and claustrophobia isn't a problem, and crowns aren't a problem, you know, all kinds of issues that are MRI issues. Yes, if you could do these things with ultrasound, it would be quite nice. The only negative with ultrasound, of course, is that you only have the tongue because the sound doesn't jump the air gap unless you put water in. But on the other hand, the tongue is one of the more important parts and does account for most of the variability. Everything else has very few degrees of freedom, and most of the sounds in a language, the more sounds you have, most of them are going to be made with the tongue.
Although you seem to be saying earlier that many of the degrees of freedom in the tongue are used independently, because there's only a few basic shapes.
Yes, that's true. I said there were 13,000 motor units, and I agree, they're not used independently. And right, okay, so let me use an analogy for the independent shapes. Of course, the tongue is correlated because it's all attached to itself. But then the question is, how many independent regions can you have? And we have, the first clear break that we see is the front and the back. So sort of a tip blade, maybe a little bit farther back versus the whole back. Then within that, you see more subtle, first of all, you see the location of that boundary moving. And then you also see within that other division, so that 5 or 6, you can see 5 or 6 independent regions where you don't simply have positive or negative correlations going on during speech. But you're right, they're not thousands. And but that's mid-sagittal. However, sagittal, medial and lateral are also fairly correlated because you either have an arch or a groove or a level with some asymmetry.
There's been some nice work in the past few years in nonlinear smoothing. So you've got some very high-dimensional data, like the positions of 13,000 units, and you're trying to fit that to some low-dimensional manifold. And that might be useful for trying to, so for example, if you wanted to say there was some two-dimensional characterization of positions on the tongue, you could plot trajectories through that by taking that manifold and flattening it out. That might give you some additional visualizations that could be useful. And I wonder if it might also be useful in trying to look at correlated data of tongue position and audio. So, you know, from the point of view of speech people, the natural question is, what's the joint distribution between tongue position and audio, and how do you smooth that, both for analysis and synthesis of speech?
That is an interesting thought. First, we have to get the correlation between what's happening inside the tongue and what's happening on the surface of the tongue, because that's also not well known or well understood. But I agree. I think that's a very good way to look at it.
And one speculative question. So I was thinking about the fact that you can, especially with the DPI, you can even get a handle on which muscles are involved in various movements of the tongue. How far are you, for example, from characterizing how you develop accents, meaning there are certain sounds I learned to produce growing up as a child, and so those are in the language that I learned.
Right.
And so when I hear other languages, I find it hard to produce certain other sounds.
Right.
But of course, that's only because my muscles have been trained a certain way. So how far are you from explaining things like that, saying these are the muscles that got trained, these are the shapes that you learned to make and you got to make?
Well, I haven't really looked at dialects, but as I said, I've looked at a couple of people who just happen to be speaking different languages.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of degree. A lot of it is a matter of degree. So the two examples I can give you, one of them is French. a colleague of mine who was French, I was presenting data about how the groove in the back of the tongue for E could be as much as 2 centimeters deep. And he said he didn't believe it. He'd never seen anything like it. So he happened to be in town and came to the lab, and we did it. And sure enough, his groove was never more than 1/2 centimeter deep. He was looking at French, and I was looking at American English. So clearly there was a big degree issue, but if you listen to the E in French, it doesn't sound wildly different from the E in English. The other example is a friend of mine who speaks Arabic, a woman speaker, and we were talking about the vowel harmony and how when you have a pharyngeal sound, then the vowels have to all be pharyngeal that go with it. And so in English, where we have a and ah, the a would be an oral sound and the ah would be a pharyngeal sound. So if she produced an oral S, for example, she would say sa, but if she produced a pharyngeal S, which I really can't do, she would do saw with the pharyngeal S. And then she told me that there was the same thing in E, that there was an oral E and a pharyngeal E, and when she did the oral E and the pharyngeal E, they both sounded like E to me. So we did our measurements with the ultrasound. We did sagittal measurements, we did coronal measurements, which is when I talked about the degree difference, and I'll tell you about that difference in a minute. And when we looked at the mid-sagittal differences between a and ah, the big difference in the pharyngeal region was about, I'm trying to remember, it was less than 1 centimeter. And when she did the 2 E's, it was the identical difference. I just, of course, didn't hear it because I don't speak the language. But it was really a perfect harmony between the 2 E's and the ah. So basically it was degree. I mean, obviously I produced that same pattern when I said ah, but I didn't produce it for E because I don't make the sound. So this was language differences, and it was a matter of degree rather than something wildly different. Now, in terms of the cross-section, we were very interested in, for example, the S and the T, oral versus pharyngeal, because the oral was, okay, so the oral T or S looked just like what you saw here, which was kind of, if this is the tip of the tongue, then it was just pretty level, or maybe even just a little bit sloped. Well, when you had the pharyngeal version, even though we think of it as pharyngeal, it was really upopharyngeal. It was really kind of poked up, almost like an ah sound, if people have a sense of what that would look like, an ah, or even almost an o. And so we said, what does this look like in cross-section? And what we found was that instead of having a groove, she had an arch. So again, it wasn't unique. It was when the tongue, in a lot of these shapes, so for example in E, the front of the tongue starts out arched, and then in the back it becomes very grooved. If you say a bunched R, it's exactly the same, but the location where the groove begins is much more anterior, and the groove is just more dramatic, and then in the back it becomes arched again. Well, when she said her oral S, the S is grooved throughout, and it's funnel shaped. The groove widens as you get farther back. But when she said the pharyngeal S, then she just didn't do that. She had more of an arch farther back, and the nature of the grooving shape changed. But she still always went from a groove to an arch. It was just, that was the degree of freedom, and it had to do with how much and what the steepness of the groove was. And of course, this is which muscles are you engaging. Are you just engaging genioglossus, or are you kicking in verticalis, which will give you a wider groove, things like that. But so yes, I guess that's the long answer to your question, which is ultimately could, but have we actually done that? No, we haven't. We're so new to the DTI. Yeah.
How you train yourself to speak certain things.
Yes, exactly. Yes, right. Especially learning a second language or something later.
Next time,
Okay, thank you. Thank you.